Hey everybody, here's your video lecture for 22.3, Choosing Candidates. I'm going to go over the vocabulary as we go through, but they're collected here for you on the slide. All right, so I want you to think back to 22.1 when we first started talking about what political parties are. One of the most important roles of political parties is nominating the candidates who will run for office. Parties play an important role in deciding who our public officials will be based on their nominations. Taking a look at the nominating process for candidates in general, and for presidential candidates in particular, is a really good way to see parties in action. Suppose you want to run for office. The first step is to declare that you want to run for that office. The simplest way to become a candidate is through self-nomination, basically just declaring that you are running for office. Usually, you pay a small filing fee to register with your government, to register to be running for a position. Another type of self-nomination is a write-in candidate, which is where you would ask voters to write your name on the ballot. Here's a collection of images related to write-in candidates. This is a headline from the 2018 House of Representatives election that occurred. It says, Mickey Mouse and Jesus among write-in votes that helped sink Roy Moore. Similar to third-party candidates, sometimes if there's enough write-in candidates, it will change the outcome of an election. Clearly, Mickey Mouse is not getting elected. Jesus is not going to become president. Kanye West, as much as he would like to be, is not going to become president. Right now, it seems that as much as he would like to, Bernie Sanders will not become president. So sometimes what happens, kind of looking at this image here, anyone else 2020, sometimes you'll get a high percentage of write-in candidates when the electorate, the people who vote, are actually dissatisfied with their choices. This anyone else 2020, that was a big theme in 2016. A lot of voters were like, I really don't like Donald Trump, but I really don't like Hillary Clinton either. So what am I going to do? That's where the write-in can come in. For some offices, a candidate may need to file a nominating petition, and this is what we do in Rhode Island. A number of voters must sign the petition saying that they support the nomination. For other offices, candidates are chosen by delegates at party meetings called conventions. Parties hold local, state, and national conventions. We've already watched a bit of a convention when we watched that segment in the Freedom Summer documentary. We watched part of that Democratic National Convention where the Mississippi Freedom Party was trying to be seated at that convention. We'll talk a bit more about conventions in a minute. A few states select candidates or choose delegates to a convention at a caucus, which is a meeting of those leaders to discuss issues and choose candidates. Caucuses are very rare. In a caucus, you're not actually filling out a ballot. You're physically using your body to show who you want to support in a vote. If you're interested in that, you can check out this video here. These are the 4 states that this year had Democratic caucuses. You'll notice throughout this year, throughout this presentation, I've been mostly focused on the Democratic candidates. Because even though Donald Trump is still, has to secure the nomination, he's pretty much running unopposed. There are 2 people who are running against him, but typically once you've already been the president, that party wants you to run again because you've already shown that you can win. So that's why we're mostly focusing on the Democrat side this time around. So this is where we get to our primaries. We've been in primary season. When I was in the classroom today, I, had a sad little tear roll down my face looking at our primary wall where we were tracking all the results. But most candidates for state and federal office are now chosen what's called a direct primary. That's an election in which members of a political party choose candidates to run for office in the name of that party. So who is going to be the Republican nominee? Who's going to be the Democratic nominee for president? That's how we find out through the primaries. The candidates with the most votes in that party's is that party's nominee in the general election. Different kind of primaries though coming up. This is just a map to show you like an example of, within a year, an election year, how the primaries may be split up. You should note and remember that Super Tuesday is always our big, that's the biggest date when the most amount of delegates are up. So we have 2 types of primaries. We have a closed primary and open primaries. In a closed primary, the voter must be registered as a party member. So if you want to have your voice heard let's say especially early on, there were like 12 people running for the Democratic nominee. If you really wanted one of those people to get the nominee, you would make sure that you were registered as a Democrat, and then you have participated and voted in your state's primary election for that party. You can only vote in that party's primary. So if you were a Republican, for example, a registered Republican, you would not be allowed to vote in the Democratic primary because you're not a Democrat, you're a Republican. An open primary is a little different. You don't need to declare a party before voting. So that's what's open about it. But you can still only vote in one party primary. So even if you are a Republican, you could still vote in the Democratic primary, but then you wouldn't be able to vote in your Republican primary. You can only have the one. Rhode Island has an open primary. That's what this map shows. Just for the Democratic Party, how they each run them. You should remember from federalism that it's a state power. It's one of the reserved powers of the states to run elections, and that's why we have all these different election practices throughout the nation. You want to consider it makes sense that each state should be able to run their own elections, because each state, number one, if you're doing it state by state, it's a lot easier to manage because it's, you're not doing a whole general election. You're kind of just focusing on your state. And then also it allows each state to take into consideration, their geography. In a place like New York, the polling sites are going to be much more concentrated, whereas in some of our less populated states, they're going to need to make sure that people have a voting place that's near them. So let's look at choosing a presidential candidate. Anyone over 35 years old and born in the United States may run for president. Realistically, though, you need a lot more than that. You got to check a lot more boxes. Typically, the candidate needs to be well known. So one of the hardest things that candidates face is just getting that name recognition. President Trump was in a really interesting position because even though he had no experience in government, he had been the host of an extremely popular television show, The Apprentice, for many years. He was kind of like on the party scene in New York for many years as well. He was in tabloids. So he was a household name. Realistically, you want the candidate to have experience in government. Again, President Trump changed that. He had never held any elected office and then was elected president. So, those expectations are changing. You also have to be able to raise enough money. We're going to talk about money in a little bit. Most presidential candidates, though, from the major parties, have held elected office before. And actually, since World War II, 80% of people who have been either the Democrat or the Republican nominee, 80% of those people have either been senators or governors. Voters want to hear things like, when I was governor, I did this. When I was your senator, I was able to pass XYZ. It gives the candidate a way of showing what they've done with their experience and showing, look, if I've done this here, I can do it as president. You got to pay for it, though. You got to pay for your primary campaign, and then you have to pay for your general election. We're going to talk about the general election later. Candidates raise much of their money from individuals. Federal laws, however, put limitations on this. Individuals may contribute, an individual meaning like me, private citizen, if you had $2,000 lying around, you can only give up to $2,000 to any candidate per election. So you can donate to many candidates. Let's say, I know in particular, there's a group called Emily's List. Emily's List is all about providing financial support to female candidates. If I believed in that, I think more women should be running for office anyways, regardless of Republican, Democrat, moderate, conservative, liberal, whatever. I think we need more women involved. You could say, all right, not only am I going to give $2,000 to Elizabeth Warren, but I'm also going to give $2,000 to Kamala Harris. I'm also going to give $2,000 to Tulsi Gabbard, right? I just couldn't give $6,000 to Warren. So there is a cap. We're going to look at these videos later on. This is a really interesting graph. This is showing you the total number of presidential campaign spending. You'll notice that there's two different types of like these colors here. We're going to talk about why that is. I'm going to be asking you some questions next about what kind of trends you notice. All right, let's look at PACs. PACS is an acronym. Stands for Political Action Committee. It's a way for people, citizens, individuals, to pool their money, put their money together to make political action. So PACs are groups. It's a group. And the purpose of the group is to collect resources to then support policies or to support certain candidates. A PAC can't take money or contributions from corporations, though. So, for example, CVS as a corporation has been very, very supportive of helping their customers and their smoking addiction, right? Smoking cigarettes is extremely unhealthy. It can be dangerous for you. That's a cause that they want. So let's say as a candidate, I was running to raise the smoking age from 18 to 21. CVS would probably support my candidacy because they would, like what I have to say about smoking. CVS, though, just can't give me money. And they can't give my PAC money because they're a corporation. It's all about kind of separating who can give what. But as a private citizen, my physician, right? Maybe my doctor who I see for my annual checkup, they want to support my campaign because they like my positions. They could give me, the candidate, $2,000, but then they could also give a political action committee $5,000. Maybe that action committee is all about let's get candidates on the ballot who are against smoking, or about raising the age, making it harder for people to smoke or vape. What's interesting, though, is that the PAC, the group that's collecting this money, they can't coordinate with me as a candidate. So I couldn't call up my PAC and say, hey, PAC, anti-smoking PAC, can you donate or can you spend $10,000 in Wisconsin to run ads? They can't do that. There can't be any coordination. Now, that being said, a candidate or a PAC could say, all right, well, I know that Paige McClatchy is going to have an uphill battle in Nevada because with all the casinos, there's a lot of smoking in the casinos. They could still spend money in that state to promote my message, but it's from them. It's not coming from me, the candidate. You guys are gonna watch this video next, and that'll give you a better explanation. Next, though, we have super PACs. So super PACs, this only existed after 2010, after the Citizens United case, which you guys will be learning about in a minute. PACs are basically super PACs are like PACs on steroids. So it's a type of individual political action committee which may raise unlimited sums of money from corporations, unions, and individuals, but is still not permitted to contribute to or coordinate directly with parties or candidates. And some of the ed puzzles you guys are going to watch, that'll become clearer, like what the difference is. But I'm going to move on now to choosing the delegates. So delegates, what are delegates? These are people that go to the national convention to represent a state. They're chosen in one of two ways. They may be chosen through a presidential preference primary. So in Rhode Island, let's say I'm voting in the Democratic primary, not only am I going to vote for who I want the Democrats to have as their nominee, but there's also going to be a bunch of other names there. They may, these would all be the people who would say, I would like to be the delegate for Rhode Island to go to the convention. They also might be chosen through a statewide caucus or convention process. Most often, though, it's the first option. That when you go to vote in the primary, you're also selecting who you would like to send on behalf of Rhode Island to that convention. In most primary states, the delegates must promise to support a certain candidate at the national convention. So, for example, if, even 51% of Rhode Island votes for Bernie Sanders, all of the delegates from Rhode Island would have to honor that vote. So the delegates are supposed to reflect what the voters want when they go to the convention. Then we get to the national convention. In a presidential election year, the parties hold their national conventions. This year, it's going to be really different because we're probably in July, even by July, I think it's July 2nd is the Democratic one. We're not going to be having hundreds of people in a room. We just can't do that. So who knows what's going to happen this year? There will still be a convention. Not only are they choosing the candidates, but they're also voting on the party platform. This is a term that you've been introduced to previously, I think in lesson 1 of this chapter. And that's where they decide, okay, when we run, like, what's our platform? Typically, because these political parties, Republican and Democrat, since they, typically are conservative, liberal philosophies, these going back to these ideologies, the party platform is not going to change a lot each time, right? There's going to be some like steady trends, and that's what we were looking at last lesson, right? In general, what do these parties support? However, from election to election, these parties get tweaked, right? Especially as events unfold and we get new information and there's scientific breakthroughs and Supreme Court cases, like lots of things happen over time, and that's why the platform needs to be tweaked. What's interesting though, or I guess it's kind of a bit of like an anticlimactic thing, is that because of the primary system, almost all the delegates are pretty much pledged to a candidate before the convention happens. It's normally not like this big mystery going into the convention who's going to be the nominee, because you already held all the primaries. So you already know in each state who does that party want. But once that president and VP are chosen through a vote, it's on to the general election. And that's what we will be talking about next. And by next, I mean at a later date, because you guys are going to have some other head puzzles to enjoy.